Welcome, weary traveler, caught in the storms of your own thoughts. Have you ever lain down after a long day, your body completely exhausted, yet your ego still refuses to sleep? It keeps analyzing the past, worrying about the future, and trying to control what was never meant to be controlled. This exhaustion does not come from physical labor, but from the ego's relentless desire to act as the captain of an ocean it can never truly command. Carl Jung taught that the ego is only a small island within the vast ocean of the unconscious. When you cling too tightly to that island, you fall into a state of mindlessness, too tired to be fully awake, yet too anxious to surrender to sleep. This video is a journey of crossing the river on a raft of wisdom, helping you loosen the grip that clings to identities, labels, and fixed beliefs. Hello, my friend. I am Milo, and I will accompany you on this journey. We will not seek stillness through sheer willpower, but by recognizing that the ego is merely a finger pointing at the moon, not the moon of true peace itself. Let Zen stories and Jungian wisdom gently guide you back to your original face, the place of pure awareness that has always remained calm beneath every mask life has asked you to wear. Take a deep breath. Set the ego, your little raft, gently down, and allow yourself to dissolve into the rest you have long been longing for. Welcome home to yourself. Yes, that is exactly how it is. There are nights when you lie down, your eyes closed, yet inside your head, everything is still brightly lit, like a room where the lights were never turned off. Worries pace back and forth. Old memories suddenly rise to the surface, and the words, "if only," keep knocking against your chest. And then you begin to blame yourself. Why can't I sleep? Why am I so weak? Why won't my mind just be quiet? But when seen through the lens of Carl Gustav Jung, the problem is not that you don't know how to sleep. The problem is that your consciousness is clinging too tightly to the role of control. The everyday ego, the I you live with, has grown accustomed to holding the wheel, accustomed to managing, fixing, correcting everything, accustomed to bracing itself in order to live properly, steadily, acceptably, and to be loved. And when night falls, instead of letting go, it tries once more, trying to think everything through, trying to resolve everything, trying to understand everything clearly. But sleep does not come from effort. Sleep comes from permission. You do not disappear into nothingness when you fall asleep. You simply step one pace back from the noisy stage of consciousness, allowing yourself to hear the deeper whisper of the psyche, something that daytime noise work and life's expectations have long drowned out. That is why the threshold of presence is not merely a moment of physical relaxation. It is the practice of an entire way of being, returning to the present, lowering the grip of control, and acknowledging that there is a wisdom within you, deeper than the anxious thinking mind. In this opening chapter, the breath is like the simplest key to open that door. You do not need to be good at meditation. You do not need to become elevated or special. You only need honesty. Honesty that you are tired, that you have tried for too long, that you no longer wish to fight yourself in the dark. When you place a hand on your chest and feel one breath come in and go out, you are speaking gently to the ego. Tonight, you don't need to prove anything. Tonight, you don't need to win. And strangely enough, at the very moment you stop trying to be an okay version of yourself, your body begins to trust you. Your nervous system begins to soften. Your mind begins to loosen its bite on itself. Jung once wrote a short sentence that reads like a signpost for this moment. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Memories, dreams, reflections. By day, we look outward too much at deadlines, messages, other people's eyes, invisible measures of success. At night, when you lie still, you are offered a rare chance to look inward. But looking inward is not digging for self-judgment. It is a gentle awakening. The realization that you are alive, breathing, present. And when you are truly present, you begin to notice something profoundly human. You have been carrying too much that was never necessary to carry. Anxiety is often not born from weakness, but from having been strong for too long. You have braced yourself to endure, braced yourself to please, braced yourself not to collapse. Now the door to sleep opens at the exact moment you allow yourself to let go. This first chapter also quietly offers a deeply Jungian promise. Sleep is not a meaningless void, but a space of dialogue. When the ego steps back, the unconscious has a chance to step forward, not to frighten you, but to rebalance you. Jung emphasized that the unconscious is not a chaotic black hole. It is a living system that compensates, adjusts, and sends signals when consciousness has drifted too far off course. Those signals may arrive as a vague feeling, a strange dream, or an unnamed sadness. The problem is that during the day, we are too rushed. We push them aside too quickly. Night is when you stop rushing. And because you stop rushing, you begin to listen, not to analyze your way to an answer, but to be touched by the deeper layer the ego has long neglected while being busy being an adult. There is a quotation often attributed to Jung that resonates powerfully with the spirit of this chapter. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Whether you have heard it before or not, its meaning speaks directly to the experience of sleeplessness. When we fail to recognize what is operating beneath the surface, fear of abandonment, accumulated, tension, swallowed, anger, the need for recognition, those forces begin to operate for us. They drive us by quickened heartbeats at midnight, by minds that refuse to switch off, by recurring dreams of old scenes. And we call it fate. I'm just an anxious person. I'm someone who can't sleep. But that is not fate. It is a message, something asking to be seen with compassion, not punished with force. The greatest strength of this first chapter lies in what it does not promise. It does not promise a trick to fall asleep instantly. It promises something deeper and more lasting. You will learn how to return. Return first to the body, because the body is the most honest gateway. Return to the breath, because the breath is the bridge between consciousness and the primal self. Return to a simple, fundamental sensation. I am here. And when you remain here long enough, even for a few minutes, you begin to witness a small miracle. Thoughts may still arise, but they are no longer tyrants. They become clouds. You do not need to chase the clouds nor drive them away. You only need to rest in your own sky. Jung called this journey a form of inner maturation. The ego does not die. It learns its proper place. It ceases to be the authoritarian ruler of the psyche and becomes a gatekeeper who knows how to listen. And that is the true motivational heart of the threshold of presence. You do not need to defeat the night. You only need to stop fighting yourself. As you soften each muscle group, slow each breath, and whisper inwardly, "Tonight, I am allowed to rest." You are doing something profoundly courageous. You are handing the guidance back to the deeper part of you, the part that has quietly supported you through countless moments of exhaustion. You do not sleep in order to disappear. You sleep in order to return. And the very moment you begin to return, the door to sleep has already begun to open. Once you have crossed the threshold of presence in the previous chapter, when the body begins to soften, the breath slows, and the mind gradually stops resisting, a natural question quietly emerges, even if you do not consciously name it. So, who in the end is the one who is this exhausted? Who is it that has been bracing all day long? Who is the one trying so hard to keep everything from collapsing? Who is the voice in your head that keeps saying, "You must do this. You must not do that"? At this delicate intersection, Chapter 2 opens not with a dry definition, but through the recognition of the central character of conscious life, the ego. In the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, the ego is not the enemy, nor is it the supreme ruler. The ego is simply the center of consciousness, the reference point where thoughts, memories, and emotions gather and declare, "This is me." When you recall a memory, feel sadness or joy. When you say, "I think, I fear, I want it," is the ego at work. Jung described the ego as an organizing center of the conscious field, a necessary structure that allows human beings to live, work, and exist within the concrete world. Without the ego, we could not orient ourselves, make decisions, or distinguish what is me from what is not me. The image of the train conductor therefore carries profound symbolic power. The ego is like the one sitting in the control cabin, hand on the lever, eyes fixed forward. Because of it, the train of life does not drift aimlessly. The ego helps you arrive on time, answer correctly, keep promises, and maintain a continuous sense of identity that the me of today is still the me of yesterday. Jung emphasized this role when he wrote, "The ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness." Ion Collected Works, Volume 9. Without the ego, there would be no subject to experience the world. Everything would dissolve into a nameless stream of sensations. But the problem and the key point of this chapter does not lie in the existence of the ego. It lies in the ego's belief that it is the whole person. A train conductor who forgets that he is only the operator, not the train itself, will begin to behave like a tyrannical master. In everyday life, this appears in familiar ways. You completely identify with your thoughts, believing every thought in your head to be the truth. You identify with your emotions, assuming I feel sad equals I am sadness. You identify with memories and social roles, believing that you are nothing more than what you have done, achieved, or failed at. In that moment, the ego is no longer an organizing center. It becomes a cage. Jung saw this trap with great clarity and warned against it in a calm yet decisive voice. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "What happened to me? I am what I choose to become." This sentence is often quoted as a motivational message, but within Jung's framework, it goes much deeper. The ego must not be equated with the entirety of personal history. It must remain flexible enough to allow something new to emerge. When the ego hardens, clinging tightly to a fixed image of who I am, the flow of life becomes blocked, and mental exhaustion is an inevitable result. In the context of sleep, the image of the train conductor becomes even clearer. During the day, the ego must be alert, vigilant, and in control. But at night, if the conductor refuses to loosen his grip, refuses to leave the cabin, the train never truly rests. You lie there, your body longing to stop, while the ego continues to scan. Did I say the wrong thing today? What must I do tomorrow? How will that situation turn out? And you call this state insomnia, when in truth, it is simply the ego refusing to hand over the shift. Chapter 2. Therefore is not merely a definition. It is a deeply human invitation to look at the ego with understanding rather than blame. What Jung offers here is a subtle balance. He does not advocate killing the ego or transcending the ego in any extreme sense. On the contrary, he believed that a healthy ego is a prerequisite for a healthy psychological life. But a healthy ego is one that knows its limits. Jung wrote, "The ego is only the center of consciousness, whereas the self is the center of the total personality." Ion. When the ego mistakes itself for the center of the entire personality, exhaustion soon follows. When the ego understands that it is only a part important, but not everything, it can finally relax. Here, Chapter 2 flows naturally from Chapter 1. If Chapter 1 taught you to lower the threshold of consciousness through breath and presence, Chapter 2 gives you a map to understand who is crossing that threshold. You are not asking the ego to disappear. You are simply saying to it gently, "Thank you for steering the train all day. You may sit down now." And paradoxically, when the ego no longer needs to prove its authority, it is finally able to rest. When the conductor trusts that the train does not need to be controlled, every second the night journey can begin. From a motivational perspective, the message of this chapter is both deep and profoundly real. You do not need to become a different person in order to find peace. You only need to change your relationship with the I. Instead of treating the ego as a fixed identity, see it as a function, a role that can be set down without anything collapsing. Jung once offered a statement of powerful awakening. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Psychology and alchemy. Acceptance here does not mean surrender. It means facing the truth directly. I am not only the conductor, I am also the tracks, the darkness, and the silent movement beneath it all. And when you understand this, sleep ceases to be a battle. it becomes a transition. The ego remains present, but no longer rigid. It allows a deeper center to guide temporarily, not to replace it, but to restore balance. Chapter 2. Thus lays the foundation for the entire journey ahead. Only when the ego is seen in its proper place can one move deeper without fear of losing oneself. And in that moment, you begin to understand that rest is not weakness, it is wisdom. As Chapter 2 closes with the image of the ego as the train conductor, necessary yet not all-powerful, a deeper question naturally arises. When did this conductor first appear? It did not suddenly descend into our lives in adulthood, nor did it emerge the moment conscious thought began. To truly understand the ego, Jung always traced it back to its point of origin, the very slow, very fragile birth of the I. And it is precisely here that Chapter 3 opens like a distant recollection, not a memory you can retrieve with the mind, but one preserved in the deepest layers of the psyche. In the earliest years of life, a child does not exist as a separate individual. There is no ego yet in the Jungian sense. The child's world is a continuous stream of undifferentiated experience, hunger then being held, crying then someone arrives, cold then warmth. There is no me, and other no inside and outside. Jung called this state participation mystique, the primordial unity between subject and world. The child is the world, and the world is the child. At this stage, consciousness has not yet risen as a center. It remains immersed in the ocean of the personal and collective unconscious, where all boundaries are still in gestation. The birth of the I, therefore, is not a sudden flash of light, but a laborious process, slow, effortful, and profoundly fragile, exactly as described. Jung emphasized that the ego forms gradually through repeated relational experiences. When the child begins to sense that satisfaction comes from outside itself, that there is a mother and a Mia, a faint center of consciousness begins to emerge. This is the moment when the child first speaks in the first person, not merely through language, but through felt experience. There is someone who is feeling in the structure and dynamics of the psyche. Jung wrote, "The ego is the center of the field of consciousness." Yet he was equally clear that this center is not present from the beginning. It is built from memories, from emotions, from moments of being seen and responded to. Each time a child is mirrored through a parent's gaze, a voice calling its name, a sense of safety, the ego gains another brick. And each time the child is abandoned, met with coldness, or overwhelmed, the ego learns something else, how to contract, defend, or adapt, earlier than necessary. The birth of the I, then, is not merely a biological milestone. It is a relational story, carrying both light and wound. Here, Jung perceived a deeply human paradox. The ego is born to help us live, yet its very birth is bound to the first experience of separation. When the child begins to say, I, it simultaneously begins to lose the primordial sense of fusion with the world. It steps out of the ocean of the unconscious onto a small island of consciousness. Jung described this moment as an inevitable turning point in psychological evolution, and also as the deep origin of human loneliness. We become individuals, and at the same time, we lose our sense of wholeness. For this reason, Chapter 3 is not merely a chapter on child development. It is a mirror reflecting the adult experience of each of us. Because deep within your adult ego still carries that primordial memory, the memory of once having been part of something larger, safer, something that required no proof and no control. Jung once wrote a striking line in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The childhood consciousness is a far wider field than that of adults. Children, paradoxically, are not less conscious. They possess a different kind of consciousness, one not yet narrowed into a rigid sense of self. When this chapter is linked back to Chapter 2, a subtle thread becomes visible. The present-day conductor was once a child who did not yet know who it was. The ego you now cling to, protect, and fear losing was born from a very primal need to exist, to be recognized, to remain in the world. And because it was born in fragility, the ego always carries a foundational fear within it. The fear of dissolving, of being swallowed back into the unconscious, of losing control. This explains why the adult ego often clings to thoughts, plans, and identities, not because it is flawed, but because it unconsciously remembers a time before boundaries existed. Jung did not view this fear as pathological. He saw it as a trace of the psyche's evolution. In Ion, he wrote, "Man's consciousness was born out of the unconscious and is continuously threatened by it. Consciousness is born from the unconscious and is continually threatened by it, not to be destroyed, but to be reminded that it is not the whole." In children, the unconscious predominates. In adults, the ego rises. And in the deepest journey of maturity, these two learn to enter into dialogue. But for dialogue to occur, we must remember the origin of the ego, not through intellectual memory, but through a gentler attitude toward ourselves. Within the context of sleep and the Jungian journey, this video invites. Chapter 3 carries a profound healing significance. When you cannot sleep, feel anxious, or sense that you must hold yourself together to survive, it is often a younger part of the ego being activated. This is not weakness. It is developmental memory. And when you allow yourself to lie down, slow your breath, and no longer have to be someone, you temporarily return to a state close to the beginning, not to reverse evolution, but to let the ego rest from its role as the center. At this point, the motivational message of Chapter 3 becomes deeply humane. You do not always have to be strong, alert, or certain of who you are. There are moments, especially at night, when you are allowed to have no name, no role, no history. Jung called this a trust in the deeper current of the psyche. And from that trust, the most mature ego can emerge, an ego no longer born of fear, but one that knows it is supported by a foundation larger than itself. Thus, the birth of the I does not close with a definition, but with a felt sense. The sense that the self you inhabit today is the result of a long, slow, profoundly human journey. When you understand this, you stop blaming yourself for being tired. You begin to see your ego as a living being that has tried its very best to grow. And within that understanding, the doorway to the chapters that follow, memory, the functions of consciousness, and ultimately reconciliation with the unconscious, begins to open naturally. As Chapter 3 comes to a close with the image of the I being born slowly and delicately, a foundational truth begins to reveal itself. The ego is not merely the result of biological development, but the product of memories gathered and organized over time. From the moment a child first senses, "This is me," to the point where an adult can tell a coherent story about their life, an invisible force has been quietly at work. Chapter 4 names this force directly, the ego as the core magnet of memory, a virtual center that binds scattered fragments of life into the felt sense of I am me. Without the ego, each moment of living would pass like unedited film reels. You would wake each morning unsure how today's person relates to yesterday's. It is the ego that says, "That happened to me. I went through that. I am still the one who lived those years." Jung called the ego the center of the field of consciousness, the structure and dynamics of the psyche. But what he implied more deeply is this: the ego functions as a principle of cohesion. It does not create memory, but it gathers memory around itself, transforming experience into personal history. The image of a magnet is precise. Lived experience is inherently fragmented. A weary morning, a sudden joyful afternoon, an unnamed sadness, a small success. By themselves, these do not form a person. But the ego draws them in, arranges them according to an implicit order, and calls this arrangement my story. Through this process, you experience a continuity of self, the sense Jung referred to as I-ness, a stable feeling of identity, even as the inner contents shift. Without this magnetic pull, conscious life would fracture. Yet Jung was careful to describe the ego as a virtual center. It feels real and solid, but it is not an independent entity. The ego exists through the relationship between memory emotion and present awareness. It is more a point of convergence than a hard core. Jung wrote, "The ego is a complex of representations, which constitutes the center of my field of consciousness." Ion. In other words, the ego is a complex, a structure maintained by the repetition of experiences recognized as mine. This gives rise to a deeply human paradox. The ego provides stability, yet it also traps us within our own story. For when the ego draws in memory, it does not do so neutrally. It privileges what supports the self-image it is protecting. Someone who unconsciously identifies as a failure will retain memories that confirm that belief while overlooking moments of fulfillment. Conversely, an ego identified with success will conceal its vulnerable fragments. Jung called this phenomenon the bias of consciousness, and it is precisely this bias that creates the rigid, repetitive feeling of "this is who I am." Here, Chapter 4 connects seamlessly with the groundwork laid in Chapters 2 and 3. If Chapter 2 helped us recognize who is holding the controls, and Chapter 3 showed how the ego was born, Chapter 4 reveals how the ego maintains its power through memory. The conductor does not only steer the present direction, he also carries a map drawn from the past. And if that map is never updated, the train will continue to travel the same familiar loop. Jung warned of this dangerous identification with a now famous line, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Though widely quoted, its Jungian spirit is clear here when the ego unconsciously selects and narrates memory according to a fixed pattern. Life begins to feel predetermined. Yet what appears as fate is often nothing more than the story the ego tells to preserve its sense of I-ness. In the context of sleep, this role of the ego as a magnet of memory becomes especially apparent. You lie down the body, longing for rest. Yet the ego continues to draw in unresolved fragments, a sentence spoken today that still aches. An old mistake suddenly revived a future scenario built from the materials of the past. From a Jungian perspective, insomnia is not merely a biological disturbance. It is the ego's refusal to temporarily release its magnetic pull. It insists on maintaining narrative continuity, even when night naturally calls for interruption. Jung did not regard this as wrong. He regarded it as something to be understood. The ego fears dissolution. It fears that if memory is released, if the story pauses, the I will vanish. But Jung pointed out that this fear arises from a profound misunderstanding. The belief that the ego is the sole center of personality. In Ion, he stated clearly, the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. When the ego is placed within the wider context of the self, letting go no longer means losing oneself. It is here that Chapter 4 offers a subtle yet powerful motivational message. You do not need to erase memory in order to find peace. You only need to change your relationship to memory. Instead of allowing the ego to pull every experience inward and declare, "This is me," you can learn to say, "This is something that happened." The difference may sound small, but it releases enormous energy. When memory is no longer absolutely identified with identity, the ego begins to lighten. And when the ego lightens, it no longer needs to stand guard all night. Jung wrote a line that resonates deeply with this spirit. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Alchemical studies. Making the darkness conscious does not mean obsessively excavating memory. It means recognizing the ego's mechanism of attracting, holding, and narrating experience. Once you see this mechanism, you are no longer blindly driven by it. Thus, ego, the core magnet of memory, is not a chapter meant to judge the self, but one meant to detoxify identity. You are invited to see your ego as a tool that once helped you survive, adapt, and grow. And now, in the safety of night, you may allow that tool to rest. You remain yourself even when the story pauses. You continue to exist even when memory is no longer being summoned. And when you begin to feel this, not intellectually, but experientially, the journey ahead opens naturally. The exploration of the functions of consciousness, the masks we wear, and ultimately, the encounter with a center deeper than the ego. But it all begins here, in the moment you realize that I-ness does not need to be held tightly in order to exist. Sometimes it only needs to be gently set down so that you may sleep, not as someone fleeing the past, but as a human being, no longer magnetized by it. As Chapter 4 gently closes with the image of the ego as the core magnet of memory, another important truth begins to emerge. The I does not only hold the past, it also requires tools to navigate the present. The ego does not exist in a vacuum. It must orient itself amid countless stimuli, choices, relationships, and possibilities. To do so, Jung proposed that human consciousness operates through 4 fundamental psychological functions. 4 inner compasses the ego uses to determine where it stands, what is happening, and which direction to move toward. At precisely this point, Chapter 5 opens as a subtle inner map, helping us understand why each person experiences the world so differently, even while sharing the same reality. In Psychological Types Collected Works, Volume 6, Jung wrote a foundational sentence. There are 4 functions of consciousness: sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. He did not regard them as optional skills to be adopted or discarded at will, but as basic modes through which consciousness engages with life. Each function answers a different question. Sensation asks, what is present? Thinking asks, what is it? Feeling asks, what value does it have for me? Intuition asks, what could it become? Together, these 4 questions allow the ego not merely to exist, but to orient itself. Sensation is the function that anchors us to concrete reality. Through it, we know whether a room is warm or cold, whether a sound is loud or soft, whether the body is tired or relaxed. Jung described this function as the confirmation that something is. Without sensation, the ego loses its anchor. It drifts into abstraction or anxiety, ungrounded. In modern life, sensation is often undervalued, dismissed as coarse or merely physical. Jung thought otherwise. He regarded sensation as the foundation of consciousness. When you attend to the breath, feel the weight of your body on the bed, you are sending the ego a basic signal. I am here. And it is precisely this here-ness that soothes a weary mind. Thinking is the function of differentiation and understanding. It enables the ego to grasp the nature of things, to name, classify, and construct logic. Through thinking, we understand why something happens and whether it makes sense. Jung emphasized that thinking is not the same as moral intelligence. It is simply the way consciousness arrives at conceptual meaning. He wrote, "Thinking tells us what a thing is." Psychological types. But when thinking becomes the dominant function, the ego tends to live in the head, analyzing itself into exhaustion and attempting to solve every problem through reasoning alone. In such cases, insomnia does not arise from a lack of fatigue, but from thinking that refuses to stop. Feeling in Jung's usage is not impulsive emotion, but the function of valuation. It tells the ego what matters, what is worth holding on to, and what should be avoided. Jung stated plainly, "Feeling tells us what a thing is worth." This function allows us to form attachments to love, and to set boundaries. When feeling is underdeveloped, people may live by logic or duty while losing contact with what they genuinely value. Conversely, when feeling dominates without balance, the ego can be swept up in personal likes and dislikes, right and wrong, without reflective distance. In either case, imbalance creates mental tension. Intuition is the function oriented toward the future and toward possibility. It does not rely on present data, but on connections not yet visible. Jung described intuition as the capacity to see what is coming. He wrote, "Intuition tells us whence it comes and whither it goes." Psychological types. Through intuition, the ego senses direction, anticipates risk, and opens pathways to creativity. Yet, intuition, when not grounded by sensation and thinking, can pull a person into fantasy, always living in tomorrow, while neglecting the present. Many people lose sleep because intuition is overly active. They perceive too many possibilities, too many scenarios, and cannot find a place to stop. The central insight of Chapter 5, and one of Jung's major contributions, is that these four functions do not develop evenly. On the contrary, he emphasized that each ego has a dominant function and a weaker one. It is this uneven development that gives rise to different psychological types. Jung wrote, "As a rule, one function is differentiated more than the others." Psychological types. The dominant function helps us adapt effectively in certain areas, but it also creates blind spots. The weaker function, often neglected, lies closer to the unconscious, and it is there that tension accumulates. Linked back to Chapter 4, a clear structure emerges. The ego gathers memory to form identity, then uses these four functions to orient that identity in life. But when the ego tells a narrow story of who I am, it privileges certain functions while suppressing others. Those who live primarily through thinking may regard feeling as inconvenient. Those who live through feeling may see thinking as cold. Those who rely on intuition may dismiss sensation as trivial. This imbalance not only generates inner conflict, it deprives consciousness of rest. Within the context of sleep, Chapter 5 delivers a very practical message. You do not need to shut off your brain. You need to rebalance your inner compass. If you have lived all day through thinking, night calls you back to sensation. If you have lived through duty and external values, night invites you to listen to your own feelings. Jung did not offer relaxation techniques. He offered an understanding of the structure of consciousness so that relaxation could arise naturally. Jung once wrote a line that captures this spirit perfectly. We cannot change anything until we accept it. Modern man in search of a soul. Acceptance here does not mean resignation. It means clearly seeing how the ego is orienting itself. When you recognize which function dominates and which has been neglected, you no longer blame yourself for being exhausted. You begin to understand that exhaustion is a signal of imbalance, not a personal failure. Thus, the 4 orienting functions of consciousness is not a chapter meant to label personality types. It is a distinctly Jungian invitation to observe how your consciousness operates with curiosity rather than judgment. When all 4 inner compasses are acknowledged and respected, the ego no longer has to strain to keep its bearings. And in that moment, consciousness can soften, soft enough to yield tonight to the unconscious and to sleep that arrives not through force, but through inner harmony. As we move through Chapter 5 with the image of the ego orienting life through the 4 inner compasses of consciousness, we begin to understand that human beings do not live only inwardly. They must also step out into the world. Consciousness does not exist in isolation. It must face norms, roles, expectations, and the gaze of others. It is precisely at this boundary between inner life and social life that the persona, the mask, is formed. And Chapter 6 opens not as an accusation, but as a distinctly Jungian warning. What helps us adapt can also be what causes us to lose ourselves. Carl Gustav Jung borrowed the word persona from Latin, meaning the theatrical mask worn by actors to describe the social role the ego puts on when it enters the world. The persona is not falsehood in a moral sense. It is a necessary psychological structure. Through the persona, we know how to behave at work, how to keep agreements in relationships, how to speak appropriately within a given context. Jung stated clearly, the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. 2 essays on analytical psychology, collected works. Volume 7. The persona is an implicit contract between the individual and society. I will present a certain image in order to be accepted, and in return, I am allowed to belong. The problem does not arise because we have a persona, but because we identify with it completely when the mask adheres to the face so tightly that we forget there was ever another face beneath it. Jung warned of this danger in a grave tone. One could say, with a little exaggeration, that the persona is that which one is not, but which oneself and others think one is. When the ego believes I am the role I play, inner life begins to wither. A person becomes functional, efficient, well-adjusted, and yet inwardly empty in a way that is difficult to name. Connected to Chapter 5, a natural transition becomes visible. The 4 functions of consciousness help the ego orient itself, while the persona shapes how the ego appears. But when 2 dominant functions are excessively rewarded or punished by society, for example, when cold rational thinking is glorified or constant positivity is demanded, the persona gradually forces the ego into a narrow image. Those who must always be strong learn to hide vulnerability. Those who must always be positive learn to bury sadness. At this point, the persona ceases to be a tool. It becomes a defensive shell. Jung observed the consequences of this identification in countless clinical cases. He wrote, "When we analyze the persona, we strip off the mask and discover that what seemed to be individual is at bottom collective." 2 essays on analytical psychology. The persona is woven from collective expectations, profession, gender, culture, family. If one lives too long within this ready-made garment, the price is a loss of contact with genuine individuality. A person may succeed, be praised, and yet feel, "I don't know who I am," when night falls. It is here that the persona begins to directly affect sleep and inner life. By day, the mask allows smooth functioning. But at night, when there is no audience, the persona refuses to leave the stage. The ego, long accustomed to identifying with the role, continues performing alone in the dark. Quiet questions arise. If I am no longer this person, who am I? If I let go of the role, do I still have value? Jung believed that insomnia, mental exhaustion, and a sense of emptiness are often signals that the persona has taken up too much space. Jung once wrote a line that speaks directly to this experience. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Psychology and alchemy. What is terrifying is not the mask itself, but the moment it is removed. For when the persona falls away, the ego encounters parts that society has not accepted: fear, envy, contradiction, the need for unconditional love. Jung did not view this as failure. He saw it as the beginning of psychological maturity. Only when the persona is placed in its proper position as clothing, not as skin, can a person begin to live authentically. It is crucial to emphasize that Jung did not call for the abandonment of the persona. He called for consciousness of the persona. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he wrote, "The persona is a compromise between individual and society as to what a man should appear to be. A compromise is not harmful, so long as we remember that it is a compromise. When the ego knows it is playing a role, it can step out of that role when needed. And it is precisely this ability to step out that brings deep relief. Within the flow of the video and the journey into sleep. Chapter 6 carries a clear healing message. Night is the time when you do not have to perform. You do not need to prove that you are fine, maintain an image, or meet any standard at all. When you lie down and slow your breath, the persona can be hung on a coat hook, not to be criticized, but to rest. Jung believed that the unconscious through dreams compensates for the one-sidedness of the persona. If by day we are overly in role, then by night, strange, even uncomfortable images may arise to remind us that we are more than the role we play. Jung expressed this compensatory principle with a profound observation. The unconscious always holds the opposite of the conscious attitude. Psychological types. The more rigid the persona, the stronger the unconscious. The more perfect the persona, the more chaotic the dreams, not to destroy, but to restore balance. When this is understood, we no longer fear what emerges at night. We begin to see it as an invitation to return. Thus, the ego and the mask. Persona is not a chapter condemning society or social roles. It is a deeply human reminder. You do not need to spend your entire life in the dressing room. You may wear the world's costume by day and take it off when night comes. When the ego no longer has to strain to hold the mask in place, it becomes deeper, softer, and more real. And in that moment, you do not only sleep more easily, you begin to live closer to your true nature, where the persona is a tool, not a destiny. As Chapter 6 settles into stillness, with the image of the persona being hung on the coat hook of the night, a layer of defense removed from the face, a deeper question immediately arises when the mask falls away. What remains? Not a pure human being, in any idealized sense, but a far more complex psychological structure, one in which the I no longer stands as a unified block, but reveals its connections, its knots, its long-formed centers of psychic energy. It is precisely here that Chapter 7 opens with one of Jung's most daring turns. The ego is not the supreme subject, but a particularly stable complex. In everyday language, a complex often carries a negative meaning: disturbance, obsession, pathology. But for Jung, complexes are living units of the psyche, clusters of memories, emotions, and images bound together by a powerful emotional core. He stated clearly in a review of the complex theory, complexes are psychic fragments which have split off owing to traumatic influences or certain incompatible tendencies. Complexes are not illnesses. They are traces of lived experience. They form when life requires us to adapt, endure, and choose, and they carry their own energy, their own voice, sometimes even their own will. When Jung called the ego a complex, he was not diminishing the value of the I. On the contrary, he was restoring it to its proper context within the whole of psychic life. The ego is the central complex of consciousness, the only complex with continuous access to the conscious field. Jung wrote, "The ego complex is as much a content as any other complex." Ion. This means that the ego, too, is composed of memories, emotions, images, and beliefs, just like other complexes. The difference is that it is more stable, more enduring, and more strongly reinforced by society. This realization fundamentally changes how we view ourselves. If the ego is a complex, then the I is no longer a fixed entity. It is a structure maintained by psychic energy. And like all complexes, the ego can be activated, challenged, even overwhelmed. Moments when you feel not like yourself, react excessively, or feel exhausted without understanding why these are not moral failures. They are moments when the ego complex is colliding with other complexes in the unconscious. Here, the image of the hero emerges as a symbolic key. Jung observed that the structure of the ego, especially in Western culture, is often shaped around the hero archetype, the one who separates from the collective, overcomes trials, defeats darkness, and asserts individual identity. In Symbols of Transformation, he wrote, "The hero is an archetypal image that represents the ego's struggle for independence. The ego is born and grows through separation. Separation from the mother, from the family, from inherited norms, in order to say, 'I am I.' In early life, this heroic journey is necessary. It helps the ego develop boundaries, will, and autonomy. But Jung also warned that when the ego identifies completely with the hero role, it becomes trapped in a dangerous narrative. It must always be strong, always move forward, always win. At that point, the ego complex becomes rigid, defensive, and prone to exhaustion. Jung stated bluntly, "The heroic attitude is not enough. The archetypes and the collective unconscious. Psychic life cannot be lived forever in a attitude of conquest." Linked back to Chapter 6. A clear continuity emerges. The persona is the role played before society, while the ego complex is the role played before oneself. When the persona is removed, the ego may still continue performing, playing the hero in silence, carrying burdens alone, enduring without witness. It is here that the deepest fatigue arises. No one is watching. No one is applauding. Yet the ego still forces itself to stay in character. Jung observed that many psychological crises arise not from weakness, but from blind loyalty to the inner image of the hero. Jung did not deny the value of the hero. He sought to place it within a larger journey. In the process of individuation, the hero does not disappear. It learns to step aside. The mature ego complex begins to recognize that it does not need to fight everything. Jung wrote a deeply evocative line in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. The core of life does not lie on the surface of action, but in the unconscious root system that sustains it. When the ego understands this, it ceases to insist on being the absolute center within the context of sleep and the nocturnal journey. This video guides. Chapter 7 carries a powerful, liberating message. You do not need to be a hero at night. Night is not a battlefield. It is a space where the ego complex is allowed to release the role of conquest. When you lie down and slow your breath, you are not losing. You are allowing other complexes, vulnerability, the need for support, the need to be heard, to step out of the shadows. Jung believed that dreams are the place where complexes enter into dialogue, where the hero encounters the parts of itself that were left behind. Jung expressed this principle with a simple yet profound statement. The unconscious is not just evil by nature. It is also the source of the highest good. Psychology and religion. When the ego ceases to fear the loss of control, the unconscious is no longer an enemy. It becomes a partner. And when the ego complex is placed into a proper relationship with other complexes, the I does not disintegrate. It becomes more flexible and more alive. Thus, the ego as a complex is not a chapter meant to weaken the ego. It is a chapter meant to detoxify identification. You are invited to see your I not as a fixed identity that must be defended at all costs, but as a structure that once helped you survive and grow. When you understand that the ego, too, is only a complex, albeit a very special one, you stop blaming yourself for moments of instability. You begin to see that exhaustion is not a sign of failure, but a message the hero needs rest. And in the moment the hero lays down the sword, what appears is not emptiness, but a deeper space, one in which the next chapters of the Jungian journey can begin facing limits, encountering the unconscious, and ultimately discovering another form of strength, quieter and more enduring. Yes, having just moved through Chapter 7, where the ego appears as a complex shaped by the hero archetype, courageous, resilient, yet also prone to exhaustion. An unavoidable limit begins to reveal itself. No matter how strong it is, no matter what story it tells about itself, the ego always stands before a fundamental truth. It is not the whole psyche. And precisely at this boundary, Chapter 8 opens with an image that is both humbling and unsettling. Consciousness is only a small island in the vast ocean of the unconscious. Carl Gustav Jung repeatedly emphasized that the ego easily falls into the illusion of mastery. Because it is the center of consciousness, it feels like the center of everything. But that feeling is not the same as truth. Jung stated clearly in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. The conscious mind is like an island in the sea of the unconscious. This island is where we stand, think, decide, and act. Yet it is surrounded and sustained by deep waters the ego cannot see, cannot control, and often does not wish to acknowledge. The first limitation of the island of consciousness lies in memory and knowledge. The ego believes it knows who I am, knows what I have lived through, but in reality, it forgets far more than it remembers. Memories do not vanish. They retreat into the unconscious. Jung wrote, "Everything that is forgotten, repressed, or lost sinks into the unconscious." The structure and dynamics of the psyche. This means that most of your psychological life has not disappeared. It has simply moved beyond the spotlight of consciousness. The ego tells a coherent story about itself, but that story is always a condensed, edited version. The second limitation, deeper still, lies in the body and biology. The ego may decide to stay awake or to sleep, but it does not control heart rate hormones, the immune system, or biological rhythms. When you try to command your body to sleep, to calm down, to stop worrying, you confront the limits of consciousness directly. Jung saw this conflict clearly and did not interpret it as personal failure, but as a collision between consciousness and deeper autonomous systems. The ego seeks control. The body follows its own laws. And when these two are out of harmony, fatigue and anxiety arise. Yet the most profound limitation of the island of consciousness lies in the collective unconscious, a realm in which the ego is almost entirely powerless. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution. Images, impulses, fears, and longings do not belong solely to you as an individual. They are the inheritance of countless generations. The ego may believe its emotions are mine, but often they are waves passing through, stirred by depths far beyond the personal story. Following the thread from Chapter 7 into Chapter 8, a clear movement emerges. The ego complex once believed itself to be the hero, but now it recognizes that the hero cannot rule the ocean alone. In Jung's language, the hero's journey always includes a necessary stage confrontation with limitation, not to humiliate the hero, but to mature it. Jung wrote in Symbols of Transformation, "Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. Yet becoming conscious does not mean controlling it, means recognizing the incompleteness of consciousness itself." Here a vital paradox appears. Only when the ego acknowledges its limits does it become more stable. When the ego stops pretending to govern the entire psyche, it begins to listen. And listening is a different kind of strength, deeper than the strength of conquest. Jung offered a powerful awakening statement. The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. Psychology and religion. If the ego views the unconscious solely as an enemy to be conquered, it will live in perpetual defense. But if the ego accepts that it is an island, not the ocean, a new relationship can form. In the context of sleep, the image of the island of consciousness becomes especially vivid. By day, the ego requires light structure and control. But at night, that light naturally dims. Waves of the unconscious rise through dreams, vague sensations, or nameless anxieties. From a Jungian perspective, insomnia often arises not because the unconscious is too strong, but because the ego refuses to step back from center stage. It remains on the island, trying to keep the lights on, even as the tide comes in. Jung did not advise destroying the island. He advised knowing that it has shores. In Ion, he wrote, "The ego is not the master in its own house." This statement is not meant to diminish humanity, but to free it from the burden of omnipotence. You do not need to understand everything in order to live rightly. You do not need to control every emotion to be safe. Some aspects of psychological life are designed to operate outside consciousness. And when you allow this, a different kind of peace emerges. The motivational message of Chapter 8 is therefore both deep and grounded. You are not weak because you cannot control everything. On the contrary, you are living in accordance with the structure of being human. The ego was born to orient, not to dominate. When you feel exhausted, anxious, or overloaded, it is often a sign that the ego is attempting a task beyond its function. Jung called this the overreach of consciousness, and the cost is mental exhaustion. And this is the crucial turning point of the entire journey, a shift from trying to control to learning to trust. Trust that a deeper order is at work. Trust that you do not need to stand guard all night. Trust that when the ego steps back, the psyche does not collapse. It reorganizes itself. Jung wrote a line that perfectly captures this spirit. In memory's dreams, reflections, Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. The most vital part of the plant is not what appears above ground, but the invisible root system beneath. Thus, the limits of the island of consciousness is not a chapter that makes the human being smaller. It restores the human being to proper proportion. When you know you are an island, you stop forcing yourself to be the ocean. And when you stop being the ocean, you begin to hear the rhythm of the water. In that rhythm, sleep is no longer something to be conquered. It becomes something that naturally occurs when the ego steps away from center stage, allowing night, the unconscious, and the deeper layers of your being to continue their work. As Chapter 8 closes with the humbling truth that the ego is only a small island within the vast ocean of the unconscious, an inevitable consequence begins to emerge, that ocean is never still. It has tides, currents, and rising waves that move in order to restore balance. It is precisely at this point of movement that Chapter 9 opens, introducing one of Carl Gustav Jung's most profound principles, the principle of compensation. This is not a punishment inflicted upon the ego. It is the psyche's innate mechanism of self-healing. Jung observed that the human psyche is always oriented toward energetic balance. When consciousness moves too far in one direction, too rational, too moral, too controlled, too correct, the unconscious responds by bringing forth opposing contents. He stated this clearly in Psychological Types. The unconscious always holds the opposite of the conscious attitude. This sentence is not a threat. It is ecological in nature. Just as the body regulates its own temperature, the psyche regulates one-sided attitudes. And the unconscious is the system through which that regulation occurs. What must be clearly understood is this compensation does not occur because you are wrong, but because you are living too narrowly. In its effort to maintain order and safety, the ego often adopts a fixed stance and clings tightly to it. A person who must always be strong will unconsciously generate moments of uncontrolled weakness. A person who always suppresses emotion will suddenly erupt in anger over something trivial. A person who insists on being good and correct will dream chaotic, immoral, or even frightening dreams. Jung did not regard these phenomena as degeneration. He saw them as messages from the total psyche. In the structure and dynamics of the psyche, Jung wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system." What does self-regulating mean? It means that when one part is exaggerated, another part rises to counterbalance it. But the unconscious does not speak the language of logic. It speaks in images, emotions, and impulses. This is why compensation often confuses the ego. Why did I react so angrily? Why did I dream of that? Why am I having thoughts that don't feel like me at all? Jung's answer is calm and precise, because these contents are not you in the ego sense, but they are you in the sense of the whole. When we trace the movement from chapter 8 to chapter 9, a natural progression becomes visible. Once the ego accepts that it does not command the entire psyche, the next step is learning how to read the signals it does not control. Compensation is the language of the ocean speaking to the island. If the island widens, the waters grow calmer. If the island builds higher walls, the waves become stronger. Jung referred to this as the law of psychic energy. Balance, a law that cannot be negotiated. One of the clearest manifestations of compensation is the sudden surge of emotion. You may be a composed person, yet unexpectedly explode in anger over something small. You may be kind, yet suddenly experience selfish thoughts. Jung believed such moments should not be immediately suppressed. He wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it." Modern man in search of a soul. Acceptance. Here does not mean acting out the impulse. It means recognizing the message behind the impulse. Anger does not arise to destroy you. It arises to signal that a boundary has been crossed for too long. Dreams are the most subtle and honest channel of compensation. By day, the ego controls. By night, the unconscious speaks. Jung regarded dreams as the psyche's self-regulating letters. In Man and His Symbols, he wrote, "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul." A person who lives excessively in rationality may dream emotionally charged images. A person who lives under rigid morality may dream instinctual scenes, not to tempt, but to expand the range of lived experience. Dreams do not ask whether the ego approves. They ask only one question: what has been neglected? Within the context of sleep and the journey of gently lulling the ego that this video guides. Chapter 9 carries a deeply liberating message. You do not need to fear what arises at night. Strange images, vague emotions, even disturbing dreams. These are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signs that the psyche is doing its balancing work. Jung emphasized this clearly. The dream shows the inner truth and reality of the patient as it really is. The meaning of psychology for modern man. That truth may not be pleasant, but it is more authentic than the daytime mask. The ego often wants to fix the unconscious, to erase bad dreams, to silence negative emotions. But Jung warned that suppressing compensation only strengthens it. Like water held back by a dam, psychic energy will find another route, often a more extreme one. When a person does not allow vulnerability, the body may force illness. When a person does not allow anger, depression may take its place. This is not punishment. It is delayed balance. The motivational message of Chapter 9 is therefore very different from conventional encouragement. It does not say, "Be more positive." It says, "Be wider." It does not say, "Control your emotions." It says, "Listen to their meaning." Jung believed that psychological maturity does not come from eliminating the dark parts, but from expanding consciousness enough to hold opposing forces. He wrote a deeply resonant sentence in Ion. The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem. Acceptance here does not mean resignation. It means containment. When this understanding is connected to sleep, a profoundly human truth emerges. Night is when the unconscious works most actively. If the ego is overly tense during the day, the night will be more vivid. But if you enter the night with a different attitude, not defensive but cooperative, the compensatory waves soften. You do not need to immediately interpret your dreams. You only need to allow them to exist. Jung often noted that many healing dreams do not require analysis. They simply need to be fully dreamed. Thus, compensation and the law of psychic energy. Balance is not a chapter that causes loss of control. It is the chapter that frees you from the illusion that you must control everything. When the ego understands that the unconscious is not a saboteur, but a balancing partner, a deep relief appears. You stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and begin asking, "Where am I living too narrowly?" When that question is asked, not with judgment, but with curiosity, the ego begins to expand. And when the ego expands, it no longer requires violent compensatory shocks. This is the subtle point of transition from conflict to dialogue, from resistance to listening. And within that listening, sleep is no longer a place where the ego is ambushed, but a space where the entire psyche quietly restores equilibrium, intelligently, silently, and more deeply than any conscious effort could ever achieve. In Chapter 9, you encounter the truth that the unconscious is always compensating for the ego's one-sided attitude toward life. When night arrives, it becomes a natural doorway through which this process can unfold most fully. If by day the ego still has enough light to retain control, then darkness is the moment when that authority gently loosens, not through force, but through a deep biological and psychological law. And it is precisely at this fragile boundary between waking and sleeping that Chapter 10 opens as a distinctly Jungian invitation: let the ego drift. Carl Gustav Jung did not view sleep as the shutting down of consciousness, but as a shift of center. The ego steps back without disappearing. it simply relinquishes its exclusive role. When this happens, images from the unconscious begin to rise, not chaotically, not randomly, but symbolically and with direction. Jung stated this clearly in The Meaning of Psychology. For modern man, dreams are the natural expression of the unconscious psyche. Dreams are not byproducts of a fatigued brain. They are the native language of the deepest layer of the human being. Following the thread from Chapter 9, the movement becomes clear when the ego learns to listen to compensatory signals. Night is no longer a place of fear. Instead, it becomes a space of dialogue. In sleep, the ego no longer asks, "Is this logical?" or "Is this correct?" It listens through images, emotions, and symbols. Jung described this as a dialogue between the ego and the self, the deeper center of the whole personality. He wrote in Ion, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. For this reason, dreams are not messages from outside, but inner letters sent from the self to the ego, not to judge, but to regulate." A person who lives too harshly toward themselves may dream of being lost in a dense forest. A person who lives through excessive control may dream of rising water. These images do not need to be understood immediately. They need to be allowed to appear. Jung emphasized that rushing to interpret dreams through rational thought is often the ego reclaiming control too soon. In Man and His Symbols, Jung wrote a deeply orienting sentence: "The dream shows the inner truth and reality of the dreamer." This truth is not always pleasant, but it is the total truth, unedited by persona or daytime attitudes. Night is the place where the ego is permitted not to maintain an image, not to be the hero, not to uphold artificial coherence. When the ego lets go, the self begins to lead. Here, a common misunderstanding must be addressed. Letting the ego drift does not mean losing oneself. Jung never advocated the extreme dissolution of the ego. He insisted that a healthy ego is the condition for dialogue with the unconscious, without being overwhelmed. But a healthy ego is one that knows when to hold on and when to release. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote, "I had to learn that I am not the master in my own house." This sentence does not carry the spirit of defeat. It carries the spirit of liberation. Sleep, in its deepest Jungian sense, is an act of trust. Trust that a deeper intelligence is at work. Trust that you do not need to stand guard all night for life to continue. Trust that when the ego rests, the psyche does not collapse. It reorganizes itself. Many people suffer from insomnia not because the unconscious is too powerful, but because the ego refuses to release the central position. It wants to understand the dream before dreaming it, to control emotion before feeling it. Jung warned against this attitude when he wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Alchemical studies. Making the darkness conscious does not happen through force. It happens when the ego remains long enough in not knowing, in vague images, in unnamed sensations. This is precisely the pre-sleep state, where rational boundaries soften, distinctions blur, and symbols begin to speak. The motivational message of Chapter 10 therefore differs profoundly from conventional sleep advice. It does not say, "Fall asleep faster." It says, "Allow a deeper dialogue to take place." You do not need to remember a dream for it to have value. You do not need to understand its message for it to heal. Jung believed that many dreams function as an automatic regulatory process, similar to how the body heals a wound while you sleep. When you enter the night with this attitude, a subtle transformation occurs. Strange dreams become less frightening. Illogical images stop being dismissed as mental noise. You begin to see them as signs of an inner life in motion. And when you stop resisting the energy consumed by control, diminishes. This is why many people sleep more deeply the moment they stop trying to sleep. Jung once wrote a gentle sentence about dreams in memories. Dreams reflections. Dreams prepare, announce, or warn. They compensate the conscious attitude. They prepare for what is coming. They warn of an imbalance taking shape. They compensate for a life lived too narrowly. Dreams are not noise. They are the psyche's self-regulating rhythm. Thus, night and the letting go of the ego is not a chapter about surrendering in defeat. It is a chapter about a deeper form of agency, the agency of trust. When the ego ceases to act as a rigid gatekeeper, it becomes a listener. And when it listens, the self can speak not through commands, but through images, feelings, and dream stories. In that moment, sleep is no longer an empty void. It becomes a sacred space of inner dialogue where you encounter yourself again, not the daytime version, but a more complete one. And when you drift into sleep with this understanding, the ego does not disappear. It is held by a deeper intelligence than itself, one that has been present long before you ever learned how to name who you are. As Chapter 10 shows the image of the ego drifting through the night, listening to the voice of the self through dreams, a fundamental question quietly begins to surface, unforced, unhurried, yet impossible to avoid, after all these acts of letting go? Where is a human life actually heading? It is precisely within this deep stillness that Chapter 11 opens as the backbone of all Jungian psychology, the journey of individuation. Carl Gustav Jung never regarded individuation as a moral goal or a state of perfection. He described it as a natural and irreversible process of psychic life in which the center of gravity gradually shifts from the ego, the conscious, adaptive, defensive I, toward the self, the deeper center that encompasses the whole personality. Jung wrote clearly in 2 essays on analytical psychology. Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost last and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. Individuation is not about becoming different from others. It is about becoming truly oneself. But this path is far from easy. If the ego can learn to drift during sleep, then upon waking, it must face a far more difficult task to look directly at what it has excluded in order to survive. Jung called this excluded part the shadow. Not darkness in a moral sense, but all aspects of the self that do not fit the image the ego wishes to maintain. Buried weaknesses, suppressed impulses, emotions that were never allowed to exist. All of these form the shadow. Jung wrote a sentence that is famous yet often misunderstood. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Psychology and religion. The shadow does not disappear because we refuse to see it. On the contrary, the more it is denied, the heavier and more powerful it becomes, and the more urgently it seeks expression through dreams, exaggerated reactions, and conflict-laden relationships. Individuation, therefore, cannot occur if the ego learns only how to let go at night, but lacks the courage to bring conscious light into darkness during the day. Tracing the movement from Chapter 10 to Chapter 11, a natural progression appears. Night teaches the ego how to listen, while waking, life demands that the ego respond. Dreams open the door. Individuation is the step taken through that door, and the first step is always the confrontation with the shadow. Jung emphasized that this is not a heroic act of conquest, but an act of radical honesty. He wrote in Ion, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What makes individuation frightening is that it requires the ego to abandon the illusion of purity. You cannot move closer to the self while insisting that you consist only of admirable, reasonable, and correct qualities. The self contains the totality of opposites, light and darkness, reason and instinct, strength and fragility. Jung described the self as a symbol of wholeness, often appearing in mandala images, circles that hold reconciled contradictions. He wrote, "The self is a quantity that is supraordinate to the conscious ego." Ion. The ego does not vanish in individuation. It is repositioned. Here, a common misunderstanding must be dismantled. Individuation is not a selfish withdrawal from the world. On the contrary, Jung believed that only when a person becomes inwardly whole can they relate to the outer world in a healthy way. When the shadow is denied, it is unconsciously projected onto others' enemies, rivals those who are wrong. When the shadow is integrated, judgment softens, reactivity diminishes, and the compulsion to prove one's identity weakens. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The projection changes the world into the replica of one's own unknown face." Withdrawing projections is therefore a central movement of individuation. Within the context of sleep and the inner journey, this video guides. Chapter 11 carries a motivational message radically different from conventional self-improvement rhetoric. It does not promise faster success, greater strength, or constant positivity. It promises something deeper wholeness. Wholeness does not mean the absence of pain. It means no longer having to wage war against oneself. Jung expressed this with quiet force in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem. Acceptance here is not passive surrender to every impulse. It is the courage to look directly at envy, at the need for recognition, at the fear of abandonment, at the fragile parts the ego once labeled as weakness. When these elements are brought into consciousness, the energy locked within the shadow is released. The ego no longer has to strain for control. It begins to serve a deeper center. This is the moment when the self begins to speak not only through dreams, but through lived choices. Jung emphasized that individuation has no final endpoint. It is a lifelong process that often becomes more urgent in the second half of life, when the goals once pursued by the ego no longer provide meaning. He wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, "The afternoon of life must also have a significance of its own, and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning." Individuation is how a person enters this afternoon with depth rather than emptiness. Thus, the journey of individuation is not a dramatic climax, but a quiet turning of the inner axis. The ego is no longer the absolute center. The shadow is no longer banished. The self ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes a lived experience, a felt sense of standing in the right place within a larger flow. When this occurs, sleep deepens not because of technique, but because the psyche is no longer divided. And in that moment, you begin to grasp a profoundly Jungian truth. The ultimate aim of a human life is not perfection, but wholeness. Not self-transcendence, but a return to the self that has long been split apart. Individuation does not lead you away from life. It leads you to live life with depth, honesty, and a peace no longer dependent on whether the ego is winning or losing. As Chapter 11 closes with the journey of individuation, where the ego learns to face the shadow directly and to place itself under the guidance of the self, a very different feeling begins to arise. It is no longer the climax of effort, nor the tension of confrontation. Instead, there is a settling. Not because every question has been answered, but because the nature of the question itself has changed. And it is within this settling that Chapter 12 opens as a final point of support, wholeness in peaceful sleep. Carl Gustav Jung never regarded the self as a goal to be achieved through willpower. He described the self as the eternal, all-encompassing center of the psyche, where opposites are held and reconciled in ion. Jung wrote a pivotal sentence: "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious." When the journey of individuation has progressed far enough, the ego no longer needs to assert itself through control or conquest. It realizes that it is being held. This shift is not loud. It is like setting down a heavy object after carrying it for too long. No declaration required, only relief. Tracing the movement from Chapter 11 to Chapter 12, the change in center becomes unmistakable. If individuation is the courage to confront, to face the shadow, withdraw projections, and expand consciousness, then wholeness is permission. Permission for the ego to merge into the deeper rhythm of the self's operation. Not to dissolve in the sense of losing oneself, but to merge in the sense of being rightly placed. Jung emphasized that a healthy ego does not disappear in this process. It becomes the loyal collaborator of the self. He wrote in 2 essays on analytical psychology, "The ego is the bearer of consciousness, but it is not the totality of the psyche." The image of the mandala, the sacred circle, appears here not by chance. Jung observed that as the psyche moves toward wholeness, circular, balanced images with a clear center often arise in dreams and creative work. The mandala is a symbol of spontaneous order, where contradictions are not excluded, but given their place. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The mandala is the psychological expression of the totality of the self, Within the mandala, light and darkness no longer battle. They coexist. And when they coexist, conflicted energy is released. Peaceful sleep, in the Jungian sense, does not come from shutting down the brain, but from inner reconciliation. When the ego ceases to insist on being the absolute center, the parts once pushed aside, emotions, instincts, memories, symbols, no longer need to knock through violent compensation. Night returns to its rightful function, a space of restoration. Jung once wrote, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in sleep, the psyche restores itself. This restoration is not merely biological. It is spiritual in Jung's deepest sense, the re-establishment of total order. Here, a common misunderstanding must be clarified. Peace does not mean the absence of emotion. Peace means no longer being stretched by inner opposition. You may still feel sadness, still carry memories, still dream, but they no longer demand that the ego rise up and resolve them immediately. Jung referred to this state as trust in the process. He wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. When the ego releases the old program, the self leads with a different rhythm, slower, deeper, and more compassionate. Wholeness in peaceful sleep is therefore not an ending in the sense of closure, but a completion of the circle. The mandala closes not to exclude, but to contain. Within that circle, you are part of the greater flow of life, not because you dissolve into nothingness, but because you recognize that you have always belonged." Jung expressed this feeling with a vivid image. "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Memories, dreams, reflections. The most nourishing part of life lies beneath the surface, quiet, unseen, yet enduring. When you enter sleep with this understanding, something subtle occurs. You no longer need to try to sleep. The ego, now properly placed, no longer clings to the task of standing guard. Conflicts that once drained energy are held within a larger order." Jung wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem." Memories, dreams, reflections. Acceptance here means containment, holding oneself as a living whole in motion, not as a project to be perfected. Peaceful sleep thus carries a sacred quality that is profoundly ordinary. No ritual is required. No vow is needed. Only rest within being held. Held by a body that is allowed to rest. Held by an unconscious that is arranging itself. Held by the self, the eternal center, where parts once split apart find their place again. Jung referred to this experience as a sense of meaning. not meaning manufactured by the ego, but meaning that is felt. If the entire 12-chapter journey were to be gathered into a single movement, it would be a movement from control to trust, from fragmentation to wholeness. Wholeness in peaceful sleep does not promise that tomorrow all problems will vanish. It promises something more enduring. You are no longer alone within yourself. When the ego merges into the guidance of the self, sleep is no longer a void between 2 days, but a source of nourishment for a life that continues to unfold. And then in the final moment of the night, as the breath evens out and consciousness softens, you do not fall into nothingness. You return. You return to the circle that has always been waiting. You return to an order that requires no imposition. You return to a wholeness that needs no proof. As Jung once said, quietly, yet decisively, where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. Psychology and religion. In peaceful sleep, power ceases to dominate, and life is held in love. If what you have just heard touches a quiet place within you, allow yourself to remain with that feeling for a little longer. You do not need to understand everything. You do not need to remember everything. Simply let it settle with the breath. If you find this irony helpful, a gentle like or subscribe helps the channel continue creating slow, spacious places like this for those who are tired and for those seeking a way back inside. And if you wish, share in the comments tonight what within you most needs rest. For now, set all thoughts aside. We do not need to go anywhere else. Let the night do its work. Sleep well, not because you have done enough, but because you are in the right place.